Um, Also, would like to announce that after the program, uh, Dr. Professor Asar Imhotep will have his books for sale, and I really would like for you to purchase some of these books for him, from him, because this is how we get information in our community. We need this kind of information. And the second thing is that, as you know, Dr. Aaron Smith is working with us now here, and he's sort of assisting me in many things, and we're just really happy about that as well. And so we're just happy to see him here. Uh, so, some people asked about Dr. Mazama. Dr. Mazama is leading the group to Cameroon, and there are issues with tickets that they're working out today, and also convention issues with badges and those kinds of things in Cameroon. So she apologizes and asked me to apologize to you. You who lay claim to the four pillars of the universe, you who count seven times, you who cross the sky in the dark, you who rise in the land of light, a spirit indestructible. If you wish one to die, one will die. If you wish one to live, one will live. Ra, the Almighty, your child comes to you like the morning star above the savannah. If you wish one to die, one will die. If you wish one to live, one will live. The great one who owns the world with inexhaustible strength, whose vast fame does not distract from authority. We say to you, fill our lives with evolving and everlasting good. You mighty one, whose seat is at the door of the universe, unseen and vast among the billions of stars, you who stand far from us and command the spirits, let our hearts be open to the majesty of the earth and heavens, and let us stand among the spirits forever. Heaven shouts, earth trembles, as you, the great comforter, go about your business, and no human can touch you among the gods. Hail, magnificence, majesty, your beauty and splendor, splash us with your radiance, and we learn how to provide for ourselves by day and by night, and we surge ahead of those who see no splendor. Door opener for peace. You are strong and mighty. You fill every space with beauty. The whole universe is beneath you. You possess it. All things are at your feet, and the earth is your keep. So may we join with your indestructibility and have peace eternal. To you, O great guardian of the roads, glorious warrior, eternal one, I raise this lowly offering. Keep evil away from my home. Keep me and all that I hold dear to my soul safe in my presence, as well as when I am away. Protect and watch over me when I am awake as well as when I am asleep. Power forever. Good divinity, with goodness fashioned by all divinity. Hail those of us who exalt your name and extend your fame. Hail, great African divinity, mighty teacher, you who have taught us how to see. Receive from us the blessings that come from our deepest sense of gratitude. You are like a quick, sharp, and vigorous bird who glides over the highest mountains with ease and surveys our problems even before we see them. We praise your name, and anyone who has any accusation against you must let it go in the morning, must let it go in the evening. Ashe. Ashe. This evening, Asar Imhotep. Boy, look at that name. Isn't that a powerful name? Asar Imhotep. You can't, I don't know how you can get deeper than that. You know, Asar, Imhotep. Wow, that is a powerful name. Yeah, because we know Asar and we know Imhotep, the first multidimensional genius in the world. And we know Asar. Asar Imhotep is a computer programmer, software programmer. He's a cultural theorist, an African researcher. He's originally from Houston, Texas. His research focus is the cultural, the linguistic, and philosophical links between the ancient Egyptian civilizations and modern Bantu cultures of Central and Southern Africa. He is the founder of the Madu-Ndele Institute for the Advancement of Science and Culture and is the author of numerous books, including his latest book, Nasuti Biti, in Ancient Egyptian, a lesson in paronymy and leadership. This brother is heavy. I'm sitting here, I took out my pen to make sure I get my notes. And I hope you take out your brother Imhotep. It's all yours, brother. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Yeah, and if you like me, you're just gonna put your phone on what they call it, airplane mode. I think maybe because this.
Testing, testing. 1, 2, 1, 2. Can you hear me well? Okay. In true African protocol, before we get started, I would like to ask my elders for permission to speak. Appreciate it. Thank you. Um, that is, okay. Y'all doing well?
We're doing well.
All right. Yeah, I know y'all could have been doing anything else, but I'm very appreciative of y'all coming out to hear me speak. I would like to first thank, of course, you for coming out, but especially Dr. Molefe Kete-Asante for the invitation and the opportunity to speak to the Philadelphia community, um, and of course the Institute, and some people not here that has helped in these projects along the way. My friend here, Gab, who will be recording. If I left anybody out, charge it to my head, not my heart. As you mentioned earlier, I'm a software programmer, and software programming is basically like learning other languages. And by doing the kind of programming that I do, you get certain insights into the human psyche, because you have to try to think on a very basic level to try to convey certain messages to other human beings in terms of the code itself. And so the computer itself has its own code, and then we have to try to translate that ones and zeros in a logical way for human beings. And when I started my studies with the ancient Egyptian language, the sesh-medu-netcher, that's the full name for what we call hieroglyphs, I started noticing the same type of patterns and clues in what they were trying to hint at us by the text itself. And so this kind of really started a journey for me with that knowledge in terms of computer programming and then applying it to the ancient Egyptian script. And in that process, after speaking with briefly Dr. Obenga some years ago, this is almost 15 years ago, when I was first in school, and he knew that I was in the computer software. He was like, "Well, you should try your hand in linguistics. I think that you'll be good at it." And the more I started delving into ancient Egypt and the kinds of questions that I was asking, the more and more important it became for me to learn and to study African languages, because it was the only way that I can get my questions answered. And so it is that conversation with Obenga, very brief. Um, I didn't have the privilege to have an ongoing relationship with him, but very brief. Um, Started me on this journey of studying African languages. And so today's topic is called The Classical Language of Africa, Why We Need to Go to the Source. And hopefully this works. There's a term in ancient Egyptian called Saruj, which is at the bottom here, and we can see the hieroglyphs here. This is the S, R, W, the D sound here, which is, there's usually another glyph for this sound, but this is the later variation of it. And it means to make secure, to set right or wrong, provide, fulfill a contract, to restore, to repair, to make new again, to make grow or flourish. Usually this is part of a phrase called Saruj Ta, which is restoring the world. And I like this term a little bit better than what we're familiar with in terms of Sankofa. Because Sankofa simply means to go back and fetch it. But this term here, and what you see at the top is the modern ciLuba-Bantu. ciLuba, or the Baluba people live in Central Africa, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Zaire. And they speak a language called Chi or ciLuba. And this is the cognate, for that term. This S in Saruj is a prefix, and so the root is simply Rouge, but we say Aluja in ciLuba-Bantu. And so it means to make, provide, to retrace one's steps, refer to place of origin, and restore. So not only is it going back, it's specifically retracing your steps to see what went wrong and to restore that which had been damaged. So it's not just simply just retrieving, it's understanding that something was broken and we need to go back and repair it to make it anew again. And so this process, this study here is a form of aluja. And we're going back to retrace our steps. We're going back to the origin, but we're using this knowledge to repair something in our psyche that has been damaged by the Holocaust of enslavement. Now, I'm going to assume that everyone in here is not linguists, so I'm not going to bombard you with a lot of linguistic jargon. And before I get into the linguistic aspect of the talk, we're going to have to go through some very basics. I know I'm speaking to the choir on a lot of these things, but it is to set a context for the larger discussion that is to come. So everyone should know that this is Africa at its very basic. Trying to figure out. Sometimes you can't assume all the time wherever you're at. So this is the continent of Africa. Humankind, it is believed, started somewhere around this area, near the Great Lakes, Ethiopia, Kenya, Uganda area. And I'm oversimplifying for the sake of time, of course. So we leave as Homo sapiens sapiens from this core center here with two arguments. That some of us came up the Nile through Egypt and left into the Middle East, while others claim that we left through Somalia, Ethiopia into Yemen, and then populated the rest of the earth. This is very important in terms of the discussion because we're talking about our classical language. And we're talking about ancient Egyptian here, but I want to put ancient Egyptian in this greater African context. And so when we understand the language group in which ancient Egyptian belongs, then we can understand better the nature of the language itself, the psychology of the people, and the culture, which ultimately developed over time. And so here's a map of our mitochondrial route. Again, for some, we went out this way. For others, we went out this way. Went through India. Some back migrated this way, populated the rest of the earth. We should know this information. I bring this up to say that it's going to become very important to understand this process, because there's going to be a group of Africans who later on, which are not a part of this original out of Africa scenario, who's going to leave Africa again, come into this area, and two language families are going to emerge, which are the Semitic and the Indo-European. And so we ought to understand that this was already populated with people. And so it's a process I want to introduce you to called convergence. And this is where, in the typical tree model of linguistics, you have just kind of like what you're in the biological sense. You have a parent who gives birth to children, and their children give birth to other children. And you create this kind of phylological tree. And of course, you know, when you have children, your children have certain traits that the parents have and that the grandparents have. They have their own uniqueness, but they still have traces of facial features, attitudes, you know, head shape, you know, skin color, whatever, of the parents. Languages tend to work like that. However, just like in biological systems, things are shaped by the environment in which they're at. And when two or more communities live amongst each other for a long period of time that speak different languages, because they've been doing trade and intermarrying with each other and things of this nature, they tend to shape the language to kind of fit what is going on around them. A lot of borrowings happen in terms of grammar, in terms of lexicon, things of that nature. And the languages begin to converge to the point where it seems as if they are one family, but they may have different historical trajectories, so to speak. And so this is going to be very important to understand when we talk about this African language family, because this is exactly what happens here, and which creates a new set of language families, but also what happens here, and we'll get into that, you know, a little later. And so, fast forward, I do another lecture called "The Fall of Egypt: The Catalyst for the Transatlantic Slave Trade." And what I argue essentially is that the slave trade is fundamentally a direct result of the fall of Egypt. Because after Egypt controlled the trade from this area here and coming from inner Africa. After Egypt fell, it opened up the markets. These folks over here and these folks over here found out that they were getting goods from over here. And so they wanted to come eventually through this route here to where Punt is and all of this. And this is a very interesting area, because even all the way down here to South Africa, because these folks were doing trade with people in India and China. And so get into around 638 AD, CE, and Islam comes into the picture. They control all of this area here. And so they're blocking these individuals up here from coming then into here. You know, we know the Arabs take control of North Africa. They take control of Spain, 1492, 1491 and 1492. They're kicked out. However, they're kicked out of Spain, but they still control these seas. So this is why Christopher Columbus and them had to try to sail around Africa to get to these goods here. So this is a very important, to understand in that context. And so it starts a scramble for Africa because they discover some areas over here and some resources. And in that process of taking these Africans into the diaspora, they did a reprogramming to where their languages were lost for the most part, their customs. We had these Africanisms, as they would say, but the fundamental essence and meaning behind the certain practices in which we do fundamentally were lost. Uh, and we have been going through this kind of renaissance for, since we got here, trying to reconnect in many ways back to Africa. So this is why, I'm going back to the title of it, why is it important to go back to the source? But why is it important for us specifically? Because of this, this Holocaust. And so we're trying to piece together our history and ourselves. And one of the ways in which you can do that, of course, is through the language. Because language is the oldest witness of history. And if you understand the languages, you can understand, travel routes, who groups have interacted with by terms of borrowed terms, with what their subsistence strategies were. All of this will be embedded in the language. And not only that, of course, the psyche, what they believe in terms of, ancestors, what do these deeper things mean? So just wanted to put it in that particular context. So we're going back from the beginning, and these folks here. So, of course, these are the routes. We're also missing Madagascar, Mozambique. I did a DNA test, and my maternal comes to Mozambique, so I'm maternally Southeast Africa, but there were some folks that were taken from over here and brought, into the States. So we understand the Ma'afa and the loss of memory, the loss of the deeper understanding of our culture. I want to kind of fast forward and skip into how the languages of Africa are currently broken down by mainstream linguists, and kind of trace it back to this individual here, Dr. Joseph H. Greenberg. There were many different proposals for groupings of African languages, and his became the most popular after reducing it to four fundamental phylum. They're called the Nilo-Saharan, Afro-Asiatic, Niger-Congo, and Khoisan. And so if you see this color map, this is allegedly where these groups are currently, these languages are currently being spoken. And so the green, the Khoisan here, Niger-Congo, which is the largest group. This one has it broken down to Niger-Congo A and Niger-Congo B, and then Nilo-Saharan here, and then so-called Afro-Asiatic. I'm going to deal with the Afro-Asiatic because this has been problematic for African researchers for very racist reasons. And so I'm just going to read from Joseph Greenberg's Language, Culture, and Communication, 1971. He argues, he says that Afro-Asiatic languages are spoken by Caucasian and Negro peoples. The Cushites and the Ethiopian Semites are often classified as Caucasoid. The Egyptians, Berbers, and the remaining Semitic people are indisputably Caucasian, while the Chad speakers are Negroid. On this evidence, it seems probable that Afro-Asiatic languages were originally spoken by Caucasians and in some instances taken over by Negroes. In some instances. So these Negroes, quote unquote, came and punched these Afro-Asiatic Caucasians and just ran off with their languages, according to Greenberg. This is going to be very important in a few more slides on why I bring this up. And so this is a problem. This is one of those attempts to try to make the ancient Egyptians, Europeans, and the culture a West Asian enterprise. And so you can see, fundamentally here, this is not scientifically based at all. It's just, we believe that these, you read in the older literature this concept of the dark Caucasians. So Maasai or dark Caucasians. I even have this book they're talking about the Batwa. It's called Pygmy Kitabu. that the Batois are Caucasians that came from Europe into Central Africa, and then it's just craziness all in the literature. And so out comes this individual researcher by the name of Lilius Homburger. She was really prominent in like the 1920s going into the 1940s and early 50s in terms of researching African languages. And she, how should I say, she's very important and controversial at the same time. For the simple fact that one, she, when looking at the African languages, she was one of the first to recognize the common kinship between African languages far flung. So based on her studies of Fulani, Bantu, and Hausa languages, she argued that there was a common Negro-African language family that was related to the ancient Egyptian. However, she had a hyperdiffusionist model and argued that the ancient Egyptian is the mother tongue which gave birth to all the other African languages. Because of that, a lot of linguists dismissed her overall thesis, which is that all of these languages are fundamentally related, based on that flaw in her analysis. And so there were some methodological flaws, but you get to understand this is 1910, 1920, and so of course stuff improves over time. But there's certain things in her analysis that cannot be dismissed that are still valid to this day. And this is important because Dr. Homburger was, if just in case you aren't familiar, this is Dr. Shekhanta Diop and Dr. Asa Hilliard on the right here. I don't know who this is. Somebody may be able to tell me. This is when he came to Atlanta, and I'm sorry. Yeah, this is Asa. I forgot who he is. If you have Ivan Van Sertima's book on Shekhanta Diop, he's mentioned in there, but I forgot his name off the top. But she was one of his early linguistic teachers. And so he wrote a book in 1977 called The Genetic Relationship of Pharaonic Egyptian and the Negro-African Languages in French. And in this particular text, he sets out to demonstrate the relationship between ancient Egyptian language and his native language, which is Wolof. And he does a complete analysis of the Wolof language with ancient Egyptian and shows that Wolof is closer to ancient Egyptian than any of these so-called Semitic languages that were alleged to be these close contenders for ancient Egyptian language and its relationships at the time, because they were really trying to push that ancient Egyptian and Semitic were really close, languages. As a matter of fact, Semitic more than likely probably gave birth to ancient, Egyptian language, which of course would mean that it gave birth to the people, and then of course they would be indirectly responsible for the flourishing and the development of ancient Egyptian civilization. And so this is important because the kinds of relationships that he demonstrated in this text goes against the convention as prescribed by Joseph Greenberg, because you have these big language families, Nilo-Saharan, Niger-Congo, Afro-Asiatic, and Khoisan, which are supposed to be unrelated languages. Well, how do you have this Wolof language, which is supposed to be Niger-Congo, showing these types of correspondences, which he demonstrates in the text? And so it makes you question the nature and the validity of the groupings that Greenberg had put together. And so this is why this is very fundamental in terms of a work that, if you are able to read French, you should get. Now, Dr. Raketi Amin allegedly has this translated into English, but they won't let her publish it for some reason. And so, hopefully we can get that, resolved soon. But it's already fully, she's translated it. It's there. She used to work with Diop in the early days as well. Which brings us to this individual and this particular text. So we should be familiar with Dr. Theophilo Obenga, who I mentioned earlier, out of the Congo, who is the colleague and predecessor of Sheikh Anta Diop, or Diop,
Successor.
successor. Yeah, I'm sorry, successor, um, who we should know from the great 1974 Cairo Symposium on the Peopling of Ancient Egypt. Him and Dr. Diop, put on a masterful uh, presentation of the evidence, which really honed in the concept of multidisciplinary approach to the study of African history, and came out victorious in terms of dismantling a lot of the claims, which were really strong at that particular period. And so, based upon the recommendations and the research that went into the Cairo Symposium, in 1993, Obenga publishes this text here, and also he's the creator of this Ankh journal, which a lot of African scholars contribute to. This is primarily in French, but they do have some articles in English if you are able to get a hold of this journal. But he wrote this text, the common origin of ancient Egyptian, Coptic, and the modern Black African languages. Introduction to African historical linguistics. In this text, he does like Diop when comparing his native language, which is Mboli, but he expands the comparison beyond his languages to various languages in Africa. And he comes to the same conclusion that Homburger came to earlier, that there's really one fundamental language family in Africa that we can demonstrate conclusively, and that is what he called Negro-Egyptian. Now, there are some linguists who have a problem with the term Negro-Egyptian, but it is scientifically based, the language family which he created, but it's also political in nature, because remember what Greenberg said earlier. He wanted to make it clear that these were Black African people related to the ancient Egyptian. So it's Black Egyptian, the language family. So, Negro or Negro does not have the pejorative connotation that it has in English, right. In the French. So they're just, it's strictly Black Egyptian, language family. So, based on, just some notes, based on his examination of Bantu languages, Mande, Wolof, Nilotic languages, and Banda, and given the many and recurrent morphosyntactic, phonological, and lexical correspondences between all language groups, Theophilo Obenga posited a common ancestral language that gave rise to all these languages mentioned. This ancestral language, which I mentioned again, he called Negro-Egyptian. This is his model for Negro-Egyptian. And so, in it, ancient Egyptian is its own branch. And then he takes the languages that were in Afro-Asiatic, he dismantles Afro-Asiatic, and just puts them into their own categories within Negro-Egyptian. So Cushitic, Chadic, and then we have Nilo-Saharan, and then Niger-Kordofanian, Niger-Congo, in these languages here. And so he lumps all of them into his Negro-Egyptian. There's a fundamental flaw with his method, and that is when you're doing historical comparative linguistics, the ideal is to have a set series of languages, and you stick to those languages only, and you build your language family in terms of your comparisons. What he did in this text, even though he used his language as the primary base language, he was all over the place finding cognates and related terms. And so this is not looked upon highly in terms of historical comparative linguistics. And so while he has the evidence for Negro-Egyptian, he didn't go that final step to demonstrate and prove the Negro-Egyptian language family. And not only that, he kept intact Nilo-Saharan, Chadic, and Cushitic, and Niger-Kordofanian. The reason why this is important is because he spent a lot of his time dismantling the Afro-Asiatic hypothesis. The problem is that the same issues that he had for Afro-Asiatic are the same issues for Niger-Congo, Chadic. None of these are genetic families. These are kind of aerial groupings that that have no basis, that they have not been able to demonstrate and prove, over time. It's just they had an idea, they just ran with it, and now they're trying to fit all the evidence into these models instead of building from scratch what they should have done. So this is why this individual in text is important. So this is Jean-Claude Mboli. He wrote a text in 2000, or I should say published a text in 2010 called The Origin of African Languages in French. Over 630 pages of scientific linguistic analysis. Recognizing the shortcomings of Obenga's work, he expands Obenga's work and demonstrate that Obenga was correct. And he first examined probably about 6 languages, and then from those 6 languages, he added an additional 8 languages. And so he examined all the paradigms from the lexicon, the grammar, even to what we call a semantax. And the semantax is basically your worldview, your cultural worldview as mapped into the language. All of this to make a stringent argument for Negro-Egyptian. And so we have Obenga's model from 1993, and this is the updated, building upon that model. So it follows to the T the historical comparative linguistic method, and some new discoveries came forth as a result of this process. So unlike Obenga's model, his model is broken up into 3 phases. Archaic Negro-Egyptian, we have classic Negro-Egyptian, and then post-classic Negro-Egyptian. And so this is the most primitive stage with a lot of monosyllabic words that were built from onomatopoeia. And onomatopoeia words are, the words are as they sound. So when you say something like somebody's cuckoo, cuckoo is an onomatopoeia. It's just, when you playing basketball and you go swoosh, it's an onomatopoeia. It's a sound that that is related to whatever the phenomenon is connected to. And so from there, we build, according to Mboli's model, we build more complex words. And so we take these monosyllabic onomatopoeias and we combine them into 2-syllable or more words and 3-syllable or more words. And at each one of these stages, we get a different complexity in terms of Negro-Egyptian. And so we have, from this archaic stage, 3 fundamental branches. And if you read in his text, he breaks it down into Kiku, Ku-ki, and Kikuki. Kiku, Ku-ki, and then Kikuki. So if you notice with the first 2, Kiku and then Ku-ki, they're 2 syllables, they're just inversed. And so what he argues fundamentally is at this archaic stage, it was kind of a free-for-all, free word order. But then when they started to branch, one group favored a determined versus a determinate, and then the other group, the determinate over the determined in terms of the syllable structure. And so you get these 2 different same words, but they're just inversed. While the third branch, because of the accentuation, it did not go through this particular stage. And this is fundamentally probably where we get Semitic from. And so if you know about Semitic languages, they're really known for their trisyllabic or triconsonantal structures. And so they just change the vowels inside to change the meanings of the words. Whereas in most of the African languages, it's kind of agglutinative. We just add, suffix, prefix, and this changes the fundamental dimensions of the terms that's being used. And so I mentioned earlier that, we left Africa. This is the map here from National Geographic. I wanted to demonstrate here that for this particular article, they argue that we have more evidence that we actually came through Yemen into India in terms of Homo sapiens sapiens. Then there's this back migration. So these Indian folks here, based on the DNA evidence, comes in a branch here, stays in what we call the Levant in the Middle East, and then another branch comes up here and fundamentally becomes the Europeans. But they all come from this fundamental area right here. And so this is important because Mboli argues that these Negro-Egyptian speakers came up out of here and met whoever was living here, and this is because of the convergence process, Semitic begins. And so we even have evidence from Christopher Arrett, who's a linguist out of UCLA, who in 2010 released an article with some other scientists demonstrating what Obenga had been arguing all along, that Semitic was not born in Africa proper. Because, you know, some people argue that the Middle East is just Northeast Africa. So it just depends on how you, I'm going by the modern borders, and so by the modern borders, the Semitic languages are outside of Africa. But it was another branch of them that went further and developed what we call Indo-European languages. And so in my Where is the Love book here, I go into the details of that. And so, you know, if you want more details, we'll go there. And so it kind of confirms, this is another linguist, nj-km.t, who argued that Indo-European came out of Niger-Congo languages. And this is his, you know, book from 2009, I want to say, Indo-European and Niger-Congo, Comparative Linguistics, Indo-European and Niger-Congo. And so we see other linguists showing evidence that these Indo-European languages come out of African languages, or, you know, has been in extreme contact with them in their developmental years. But with Mboli's model, he proposes something that is going to be controversial for a lot of people who study ancient Egypt. For years, we've been taught that the Coptic language is the last stage of the ancient Egyptian language. So you have Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, Coptic. That's what the argument is. He said, based on a strictly linguistic analysis, we discover that Coptic is a totally separate language, and that Middle Egyptian is a second language, and that they both come from different branches of Negro-Egyptian. And so we see it in his model here. So we see Middle Egyptian, Hausa, Zande, Mande languages, Gabaya, Proto-Bantu, Bantu languages. These belong to a branch called Bere. There's a second branch after the post-classic period. This is the period where I talked about that convergence, where a lot of these Negro-Egyptian speakers have been living amongst each other for a while, and their languages begin to converge, and there's a lot of borrowing and shared grammatical features that are happening at this stage. But then they break off again for some punctuated event, and two more fundamental branches develop. And this word is a word for liver in these languages, but he's showing how the structure of the word is different in these languages. So the same word for liver, they would say bere in the bere branch, where in the Behir branch, that's how you pronounce it, you see here is consonant, vowel, but here is consonant, vowel, vowel, consonant. Different word structures that we discover here. And so what happens is that, you know, because Coptic and Middle Egyptian have been living in the Nile Valley for so long, that they converge to the point where we think it's one continuous language, but in fact they are not. And so what probably happened, what I suggest in the book, in the Nesubiti book, is that it's probably what happened like in England, when the French took over England. But England didn't have any writing before, you know, fundamentally before the French came. So the French were the elite. And so the language of the elite was French. And we get like 30 or 40% of our vocabulary from French because of this fundamental period and in terms of the Normandy invasion. After the French got kicked out, of course, we keep all the borrowed vocabulary, the shared grammar, and all of this other kind of stuff. And so because we know this history, we know that there are two separate branches. French belongs to the Romance, Latin branch of Indo-European, while English belongs to the Germanic. And so these two, although related cultures, converge for some point in history in the Nile Valley. Nile Valley. In England, in Great Britain, that whole area. Uh, and it would be a mistake to argue that because we have a whole bunch of French vocabulary and some shared grammar, that English is the last stage of French, so to speak. They're two separate languages, and it's quickly understood once we do the comparative analysis. So it's the same thing he argues with Coptic and Middle-Egyptian. So this is a fundamental break between from the mainstream Egyptology, because they didn't do the work. It's just assumed. Oh well, they were here last. They're the writing last, so they must be the last branch of the language. So there was no analysis done. So what I like about Mboli is that he doesn't assume anything. He lets the evidence speak for itself. And so when you're able to do that, you discover certain things that others, because of their assumptions, gloss over. And so I'll keep it moving. These are the 10 onomatopoeia words, root words, that he reconstructed in his analysis. So ke, hu, chui, hu, nge, hui, I, u, a. I'll just take the first two. Ke, the sound of dry wood being cut, sound of cracking of a branch. Hu, the action of blowing breath. This is in the archaic stage of Negro-Egyptian. I mentioned this earlier in terms of this is from his actual slide as well, in terms of the combining during the second stage of the consonant vowel. So we see, two different, so he's saying the stress is in red. So we stress the first syllable and then the last syllable is not stressed, but in the other branch, the first syllable is unstressed, or the last syllable is stressed. Again, I won't get into the details of why that's important in terms of stress, unstressed syllables and vowels and things of that nature. But we can see, at this in the second stage is kind of a hunter-gatherer stage, and so I even heard a proposal in terms of the Khoisan arguing, because the Khoisan people have the cliques in their language, and that more than likely it developed as a result of hunting and not trying to scare the game. So how do you communicate at certain distances? It's something that blends in. It's not like, hey Robert, come over here, and scare all the game and stuff away. So that's one proposal. I don't know how you would prove that, but I think it's plausible. We'll continue. Again, I told you about that kikuki. What he argues, and this is probably going to be very controversial, is that the vast majority of the Negro-Egyptian word and vocabulary comes from a word for tree. And, we got to understand how words are built. Like, you got to understand, like, I had a video ready, but it was just acting up. I didn't include it. But it's this linguist, one who's very racist and just off the wall. But, a broken clock is right twice a day. And on this particular point in the lecture that he was doing, he mentioned that when he was in South Africa studying certain Bantu languages, for the people who did not have writing, he said it was a woman who asked him a question, do you know all the words in your language? And he was like, well, no. He's like, well, we know all the words in our language, And he's like, well, how can you know all the words in your language? Not understanding that in the oral tradition, you can't have thousands upon thousands, saying the words, you're not going to remember all of them. So you keep a small group of words and you just combine them in a way that you can expand to discuss, different aspects of your reality. And so, we see this evident in the reconstruction. So, for example, this word ka, or ki for stick, we know it in ancient Egyptian is ket for thing, but the determinative still has the stick. And if you know anything about the ancient Egyptian writing, they did not write out their vowels. And so how do you know what the word is talking about with just consonants? They put pictures at the end of the words that coincide with the, the fundamental word itself. So when we're talking about a thing or an object, he'll put a thing or an object. If it's an idea, it's a papyrus roll, to get you to think about thinking and stuff like this. Dealing with nature, water, whatever, they put a determinative at it. And so this word ka or ki becomes a word for object, but then it has an expanded meaning for tool, for thing. It becomes in a secondary semantic branch for hard, force, then hurt, dangerous, stone. All from these same fundamental roots. This ku, tree, word for foot, place, to be. This is ultimately where we get the word geb from in earth, and igbo, forest. So when we talk about the Igbo people, this is the people of the forest. It's the same word as geb. We say geb in ancient Egyptian. It's just a word for earth, land, forest, all of that. But this ku, the W becomes rounded and becomes a B sound. So that's where the B comes from. But, again, I'm trying not to get technical, but, the same word for foot, place is, again, the same word for ground, earth. Actually, this is where we get the word ma'at from as a base. Because if ma'at it's a word for foot base. And actually even the word kemet itself. And so I know in certain circles I've upset a lot of people because they want to argue that kemet means black. But it doesn't. It's just a word for land, country. But it has a more fundamental meaning of foot, ground. And so that's what they associate. The human body is the basis for all of our language, and so they related everything to the foot, which also relates to the tree. And I put forth the hypothesis that this may be evidence, from the from an evolutionary standpoint of coming from, the forest in terms of that evolution, because the tree is our life, so you're going to relate everything to it. But I won't get too deep into that. Just some more examples how the concept of firewood ends up being word for light, heat, day, month, tomorrow, time, things of that nature. Even the word for spirit coming from a fundamental word of appearing, coming forth. You know, all that's in the text, so I won't go too deep. I want to get into some other things. So from here, he argues that Negro-Egyptian starts somewhere in the Great Lakes region, and then disperses these languages which he examined: Bantu, Zande, Hausa, Bambara, Medu-Egyptian. This is the Bede branch right here. This is the Beher branch: Shango, Wolof, Nur, Luo, Somali, Coptic. And these groups have been interacting over the years, sharing vocabulary, and as a result of sharing vocabulary, words that sound different but ultimately have the same roots can now be specialized in a certain way. So like we have fire in English, but we also have pyro. Pyro and fire are the same exact word. But since we have fire and we use it in the fire sense, we use pyro very narrowly. And so we put it in pyrotechnics in terms of, going to the club and the concert and fire and stuff all the way around. But it's the same fundamental word, but pyro is a borrowing. And so the same type of things that you see here. So it mirrors what Diop proposed in terms of the origin of these Negro-African languages. And so you see here a fundamental dispersion point from Central Africa going this way into these different areas. And so I bring up this text here, the ethno-cultural relationship between ancient Egyptian and modern Bantu, by Esau Ngome, or Ngome. I haven't heard it pronounced, so don't quote me on it. Because he argues that Bantu fundamentally comes from the Nile Valley up here, whereas Mboli argues that Bantu originated in the Great Lakes region and then kind of spread out, from there. This is another controversial thing because linguists argue that Bantu started in Nigeria or southern Nigeria, Cameroon, and then spread out. And so they're trying to find evidence for this great Bantu migration, which the evidence is real shaky, but linguistic evidence demonstrates that they originated in the Great Lakes region. This is another text, a restatement of the Bantu origins by Alfred M. Minyara, 1992, who argues the same fundamental thing, that from here, Bantu spread into to southern Central Africa. I bring this up because there's a citation in this text here, Self-Healing Power and Therapy by the late Dr. Kimbwandinde and I'll just read it. The text is actually from Babatudi and Bantu Migration and Settlement in Le Mans Congo Cultural Collection. It's on microfilm somewhere in Sweden. They're interviewing, this is published in 1911, so they're interviewing somebody there and they're telling them stories of where they came from in terms of the Congo. And he says, a long time ago in antiquity, people did not exist in this lower Congo. They came from the north of the country. There is also in the north people who came from far off north, the very north of Kayinga. Kayinga is the name of the country region where lived our ancestors in antiquity. There they already knew how to weave the cloths they wore, forge hoes and knives that they used. The main reason for their coming to this country or this area was the famine that hit Kayinga. For many years the drought reigned. Crops and fruit trees they planted dried up. They suffered a lot for this. Unable to support the suffering, they said to each other, let's go to Banda Mputu. Let's pass through the dense forest, the unbreakable wall, and organize chieftaincies, because we have a lot of hunger up here. So they agreed, let's go. Now, Kayinga is a word, their indigenous word for the Sahara. And so we have an oral evidence of them coming from, matter of fact, I think I have a slide. No. Okay, from the Sahara region. Where in the Sahara, we don't know. But given some other evidence, it could be that, certain Bantu-speaking members came from up here. And when I do a lot of my analysis with Bantu languages and cultures, it seems like that is the truth. And I had Dr. Mubabenge Bilolo some years ago in Houston, and he spoke at the University of Houston. I have the lecture online if you search Mubabenge Bilolo. And he was talking about where he's from, that there are certain oral traditions of certain royalty coming down the Nile into where he, currently lives in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So this is something that is ongoing in terms of my investigation, so we'll see about that in the future. But I wanted to just real quickly, for the sake of time, these are two hieroglyphs in the ancient Egyptian writing script. They usually pronounce this as like ah, and this one ah too for some reason. But this is actually a K sound, and this is a nasalized volar trill, which is an R sound. Which is, when we compare them to their Bantu languages equivalents, and the reason why I deal with Bantu a lot is because Bantu is very conservative. Based on the given evidence, it actually preserves more of the classical Negro-Egyptian mother tongue. And so when I do comparisons with Bantu, I do it so I can get the older pronunciations and structures. So like when we say Ma'at, it's not really Ma'at. It's really Malega, Marega, because those two A's aren't really A's. They're, this is a K or NG sound, and this is an R, which goes to L or N, or something to that nature. But that's another discussion. This is just for the record, so you can compare, to complete, this is a K sound, kind of a rounded K sound, like Ku. But, it's NG in Bantu, or corresponds with NG in Bantu, so we say Kalunga in Kikongo, Kalunga again, the tie bind. Captive or bound person is, we say unk, but that sound here is really a K sound, so Kanga, to tie up, to capture, to bind, we say ah, like in per ah for the pharaoh, but it's not ah, it's, really like kala, kara. So in ciLuba, Kikongo is Nkole, prominent or powerful man, God, great chief, you know, and I got more evidence, of that. So it also, in all of the W and Y sound in Egyptian interchange. So this is the word Kayinga in Egyptian, so to speak. And so it means to roast, parch. This is another variation of Kayinga without the K prefix. It's just Yinga. In the book, I demonstrate that this N is really a ng sound. So this is Yinga or Yog, burn, but it's a desert valley. So we're seeing the same names. They have the same words for the desert. So this is very fundamental because they keep talking about a Bantu migration, but what caused the migration? More than likely the Great Desert, because they probably lived in the Sahara when it was green. And the desert, and the drying desert probably pushed them down into Central Africa, where they met with some other Bantu speakers who hadn't left the area since time immemorial, and some other things happened. But we'll keep it. Try to make this fast. One of the reasons why we go into these different languages is so we can. I mentioned earlier, the Holocaust and things. There's no living group of people who said that, for the most part, in Egypt, that they are to continue, they still speak the language and they still keep the culture and things like that. So we know it's now the Arab Republic of Egypt. It's not Kemet, it's not Tamari no more. And so the language is pretty, for the most part, lost. There are some groups that used to live there who carry some of the traditions, like the Collagen people in Kenya, Uganda. There was one of the military branches of ancient Egypt. So they still hold the oral tradition, same deities, Isis, customs and things. I would examine the work by Dr. Ku.Swika Madu-a-Ndele, if you have a chance, on the Collagen people. Very interesting group. But there are certain concepts in ancient Egypt that are obscure, and we really don't know what it is today. We can kind of get the context if you read the sentences, but that deeper knowledge of what is going on is missing, because the ancient Egyptians didn't write like we would write, anticipating people that are going to study us in a very detailed and critical manner. They just wrote assuming that there will always be, and the people would understand what it is that they're talking about because it's part of their culture. And so I don't think they anticipated that their culture would be no more, and thus giving them a reason to explain what they mean by this, and this. And so we have to go different routes to try to get to the core of what they mean. And so this is where historical comparative linguistics allows us to penetrate, certain things that are obscure. And so I'm just going to give a few examples, and then I'll end it. And so when we talk about the soul, the so-called ka, remember what I said earlier, that this is not an A sound, this is an R. So it's really a ka, kar, something like that. The soul is represented by this hieroglyph here, which is two arms raised, And so the ancient Egyptians had utilized what we call the rebus principle. And that's when they can use, there's a lot of homonymy. And so they can use an object that is pronounced the same as another word, but use that object to pronounce the other word with a different meaning, if that makes sense. So this actually is for arms, and hands, but it's used because there's another word that sounds just like it that is the word for soul or spirit. You get what I'm saying? So this isn't necessarily the soul, but it's just used because of that particular rebus principle. And this is the Gardner sign D28. So it's defined as the soul, spirit, essence of a being or personality. As I mentioned, this is a KR or KL root. The grapheme is a nasalized volar trio. That's just to demonstrate that it corresponds to R. It's just linguistic stuff. I'll skip this. It's in the books. These are different variations of the same word in other African languages. So when amongst the Akan, they say okra, so the ga kla, and Belin Cushitic Nkera, Kwara Cushitic Nkera, Tayo Naja Congo Nkira. spirit. These are all the same word. So it's not ka. It's I like to say the Akan variation, okra. You know, but what we come to discover, based on the linguistic analysis, is that the soul is really your name. So people think that the soul is some entity, that's kind of attached to you. That's not what the soul is in Africa. It's just your name. And your name, the word for name is related to the word for calling or to speak, or speech. And so this is fundamentally where it comes. So even the word call in English is the same root, call. It's to mention. This is why I had to mention why the relationship between Indo-European and African languages. Because we still, even though you're not in our full African context in terms of language speaking, you still are speaking African words all the time. The seat of the okra is the shoulders, or that the shoulders balance the soul and the head as the head. The seat of intelligence sits on the shoulders. All this up here. Still, the fact is that to call anyone by name is to call the soul of that individual. And since the soul is an intangible agency, it is assumed that the dead has appeared in spirit. Again, the okra name soul. When you're calling out someone's name, you're calling out their soul. And I give plenty of examples to show that this is not an isolated incident over here in Ghana. But this is the ka in ancient Egypt. This is the statue of Horarimbra. It's in the Cairo Museum when you go there. So you want to take pictures, they won't allow you unless you got some money to bribe them. But for those who've been to Egypt, but you see this, you see what he's talking about visually in ancient Egypt. And so by the study of languages and knowing these deeper things, we can make connections very fundamentally. Now, this, of course, would be isolated. You just don't depend on one thing. Of course, I like to bombard with coincidences that, you at a certain point, you can't argue it's a coincidence, anymore. And so there's a process in linguistics called paronymy. And that's what he mentioned in terms of the book. And so paronymy is the assumed relationship between words based on their similarity in pronunciation. And so they could linguistically have totally separate, historical trajectories and roots, but because the layperson is not a linguist in these oral societies, they feel that there's a relationship between all the words that sound alike. So one of the fundamental differences between the Indo-European and African languages, which you find, is that African languages, especially Negro-Egyptian, has this tendency to want to synchronize and synthesize everything, whereas the Indo-Europeans want to separate and compartmentalize, And so in that process of conversion and synthesis, you see that these concepts that are different words fundamentally, these are actually the same words historically, because your speech is simply your thoughts projected. So there's no difference between speech and thought. They're the same thing. So, but that's because of the thought aspect of it to think about, which is why the okra is located in the head, because that's where your thoughts are. And so, understanding these things in terms of your soul, personality, and then of course to carry it to support, which is why it's on the head and you see the shoulders, why all of that is related to them in the language, even though they're separate concepts, because they sound similar. These Negro-Egyptian speakers tend to merge these concepts. And so we can tell that this is an idea that has been before the emergence of ancient Egypt, because we find these same words and same semantaxes in all these different branches of Negro-Egyptian. So it's not a borrowing from ancient Egypt. And so these same fundamental ideas are deep in our history in terms of these African languages. So this is, from Mdupe-Oduyoye, and he wrote an article, he wrote several in this book actually, called Traditional Religion in West Africa. He says, we can think of the Kra as consciousness, the part of a man that responds to a calling, by calling the names of your ancestors, you're calling their souls back. Reincarnation. All reincarnation is you naming your children after one of your ancestors. That's all it is. So we think it's an essence. Now we can say to a certain extent in terms of blood, DNA, all of that, and emerging in the youth. But all reincarnation for our ancient ancestors was just the naming of our children after ancestors, which is why it was important for you to know their names. This is how you bring their essence and their spirit back. You name your children, what your ancestors were named. There's a different ideogram just to show, this is the head of a cow. So the bull symbolism, they merged everything. It just showing that this also means head, this ka. And so again, the head aspect, again, they're merging different concepts together. And so another thing, we want to clear up is what the Ankh symbol is. And so you'll read a lot of places that the Ankh is the womb and the phallus united, and no, that's not it. All it is your thoracic complex.
There you go.
They were dissectors, they were doctors, and so a lot of what the symbolism is just parts of the human or animal bodies, and so a lot of these quote unquote priests are just surgeons. We put all this spiritual. They were spiritual people, no doubt, but a lot of the stuff they over spiritualized, when in fact it was just everyday common stuff. This is how it's onomatopoeia, not onomatopoeia. Yeah. It's just everyday common stuff, and so like it's reinforced in terms of the spinal cord. We know this is the Djed pillar of Osiris, which is the backbone of the spine, and so when you look at your actual, but this could be coincidence, and so I have to go further into the languages to see if that is in fact the case. One of the things I need to mention, which is further proof of this, is because your thoracic complex, which is all of this up here, protects your lungs and your breathing apparatus. And so they understood this, and why every single time you see the Ankh and the deity, always putting it up to somebody's nose. You always wonder, why are you bringing the Ankh, to their nose? Because it's also dealing with breath. Again, they're surgeons. They understand the body, so they have all these different signs and symbols just to remind you of the functions of the body. Or the priests, the people responsible for health. That's their number one thing. It was health. That was their number one concern. But as I mentioned earlier, this is a K sound. It's not Ankh. It's like Kung. And so we can cross compare this, because the word for Ankh is also a word for scarab beetle. And in Kikongo, Ikoka. They don't have it nasalized here like here, but it's the same word, Ikoka, beetle. We can further demonstrate this. There's a place called the House of Life, which is the name of a college of priests. They call it Per Ankh, so to speak. But Kikongo lets us know it's more ancestral pronunciation in terms of Kukanga or Kukongo. Palatalized form, it's Zingu. And so, like how he mentioned Giechi, but it still had the K sound. It's a process called palatalization. When you see an I or E behind a velar sound, it often palatalizes the word and moves the pronunciation towards the palate up here. So, a ki will become chi or chi. Like chui is the word tree for language, is the word ki in Kikongo or Ki Swahili. It's palatalized, so that ki becomes tree. You get what I'm saying? So it's the same thing here, that tree can become a D or a Z sound. So for the word for life, Ankh is a word for life, it's Zingu in Kikongo. But this Kanga, the site of initiation, the institute that folds, ties, and unties principles of knowledge. This is important because the earliest Ankhs, in terms of the Old Kingdom drawings, were strings or ropes tied in that fashion. And so it's a word for rope, which is why it's the same word for captives, bind, like you saw earlier. Again, Rabe's principle, paronymy, they try to combine all of these concepts because they sound alike. So a lot of these concepts in rich philosophical things that we see in ancient Egypt is only a result of the words sounded alike, and so we need to create something. So, like for instance, the the creation of a myth where Ra gives birth to humankind by shedding his tears. Ra is known by a word called Remi, which is a weeper. The word for humankind is Remech. The word for tears in Egyptian is Remiyet. Because they had that RM root in the beginning, it inspired a myth in which they understood that we are one with the Creator as an emanation of it, versus the Creator creating ex nihilo over there, this creation, and I'm over here. You are a part of, because God is an infinity in Africa, and you can't exist outside of the infinity. You can only exist and develop from within. So evolution is a fundamental aspect of African spiritual traditions. But that's neither here nor there. Last one, get on this word, netcher, which is God in ancient Egyptian, or we say Chikam, after Mubabingi Bilolo. They say, God. It's like yeah and no, because it's because a God in Africa is really your parent or ancestors. It's something that gives birth to something, and so of course you have the ultimate netcher, and then you have the netcheru, which is that which has been born from it, but gives birth to other forms. And so your parent, your mother, your father are your netchers. But the word netcher itself, again, the ancient Egyptians did not write out their vowels. And so we're thinking it's one word when it's several different words. And because of their similarity in concept, they merge in the ancient Egyptian language. And so the king was also called Netcher. But it's not saying that he was some kind of god in the sense of, you bow down, weaklings, and do my bidding. It's nothing to that nature. It's just somebody who is exalted, is a big man. Some of the words that are cognate with Netcher in Bantu and Collagen, in Kikongo is Intella, the measure or extent of height. Height, stature, a person's only. Intella, tallness, height, size, stature, a person. Why do I have that twice? Collagen, the people I mentioned earlier. Or great, Torat. Sky, the on high, the heavens. God, Toor. Elevate, Toror, Toor. Massive and high, elevated. Net Toor, the exalted one, the almighty, a term for the creator. That same word netter without the n prefix, n is a prefix, the root is tr, is in the word Obatala. Now, folk etymology says Obatala means king of the white cloth. That's not what it means. There's a word tala that means cloth in Yoruba. Then there's a word Allah that means white. Because they sound the same or similar, they merge that. Again, they're not historical comparative linguists. But the word tala, all it means is exalted. When you say Obatala, you're saying the exalted king. And so this is trying to give a context for, like when you're saying your majesty, your highness. That's all a netcher when they're calling the king netcher, your highness. In Kikongo, in Tello, a little portion of added to what is bargained for, something extra. So the fundamental concept is increase, size, tallness, height. So either up or wide. It's bigness. Intotella, emperor. He's the big king over all the sub-chiefs. And then Tala in Yoruba, said it's cognate with Talul, exalted, lofty. In Arabic, when they say, Allah wa Ta'ala, exalted is He, that's the root, saying the word. It's just an exalted. But that's just one variation. And they have different determinatives that'll let you know probably which word is being, we keep mixing, we're not being thorough in our analysis in terms of Egyptology and taking, everything for granted. But a real specific analysis will tell you that these are separate words, different pronunciations, and the different determinatives will tell you in what context, these words. So normally when you would see this, you'll probably see the either Heru or Ra bird on top of a standard as the determinative. Now, when they want to talk about the concept of spirit in terms of netcher, because netcher can mean spirit, it's a different connotation, but fundamentally almost related to it in terms of bigness, tallness, because again, the fundamental root means expansion, so that which goes beyond, with that which is outside, that which is far, so to speak. Same fundamental underlying concept of increase. So a cognate for the word netcher amongst the Lugbara people is the word adro. They don't have the N, especially in rivers. The word for netcher also means river. Don't have time to get into that, but there's a lot of cleansing rituals dealing with netcher, but again, that's primarily because of the word for water and rivers. In Khan, it's called toro or in toro, and it's the rivers. That's the name for the rivers in which you wash, and it also deals with your patrilineage. They'll ask you what river you wash in, because there's 4 assigned rivers, and you belong to one of those lineages that are attached to the river. But that's all in the book. That's another part of the discussion. He is also, especially in rivers, he is also found in large trees and thickets and on high mountains and rocky places. He is in every stream. Adro is common to all Lugbara. In addition, each clan has its own spirit or adro or netcher. The clan is a dispersed group which is not concerned in corporate activity. This spirit is also a manifestation of God's power, and in many cases is thought of as having been a distant ancestor. Again, it seems like it's all over the place, but that's because historically the word, for netcher sounds like all of these other words for water, for parent, for spirit, for height, and they all, merge. And so we see, again, this is evidence when we're talking about the semantaxes of the common origin of the ancient Egyptians and these other groups, because they're preserving pronunciations that the Egyptians did not have. The Egyptian version is eroded in certain contexts, which means that if they borrowed it, they would have borrowed the eroded version, not the more ancestral. So it can only be explained from them coming from a common ancestor. And so we see these same ideas in terms of netcher all across Africa. Again, I give more examples. Time will not allow me to do it. This is a reconstruction of the word netcher coming from Mboli. We won't get into that. I just end. I appreciate y'all.
You take questions.
Yeah.
Wow! Oh boy! Wow! I hadn't seen all these people who came. Wow! This is beautiful. That's beautiful. You just got your doctorate, right? I just got my doctorate, my second doctorate today. It was very heavy. Brother, appreciate you so much. And we do have time for questions. One of the things that, as he was speaking, I've been working today on my presentation. Brother Ibo Shanga will probably hear some of the same talk on next week in Cameroon, because I'm speaking on the deep structure of African spirituality. And one of the points that I'm making is that African spirituality is really about ordinary life. It really is not about the supernatural, and it's not about the phantasmagoric. And yet, what happens is that Europeans love to take photographs of possessions and that kind of thing, because they don't understand that the whole idea behind African spirituality is that that our ordinary life is lived in divinity. That divinity is all around us. We live in divinity. And in fact, when you see the things that seem to be extraordinary, it's because we're trying to put back in place the harmony that has been broken by the chaos that exists in life. When people get real sick, something happens, and an earthquake happens, then you got to have ritual, you see? You got to put things back in order. And this is, so the whole notion is so messed up because we think with a Western frame of mind. And what this brother did for us today is just wonderful because he opened our minds up to a way of thinking about ourselves that we never think about. So every time you say to me, hello, Malefi, you're announcing something about my soul. And my name, the keeper of the tradition. That's it. So every time you say Malefi, you're saying keeper of the traditions. And I shake my head. Yeah, that's right. That's me. This brother is ready to answer questions. And my brother back there has one first. And then go right ahead. And then I'm going to ask him a question about Kim. And I want to know, because he made an interesting statement about Kemet. And I just wanted him to answer that. But I'm going to wait till y'all finish first. Yes, sir, brother.
Okay. Brother, so, beautiful presentation. I got to do some reprogramming. My question I'm asked, I have to ask you, being a descendant of enslaved Africans and our customs being broken and having a name given to me from a slave master, when I call my name to my ancestors, am I calling their soul, or is it different because it's coming from another type of name, a European name?
I mean, a name is a name. Your immediate ancestors probably wouldn't answer to any other name other than what they knew themselves as. So if Mama Joe is what her name was, and that's who you would call. I understand the situation, but it's really just about the name itself. And so, because a name fundamentally is a shrine for your spiritual power, according to African people. It houses and it captures a particular energy signature that fundamentally exists in the universe. And so it comes with a personality, so to speak. And it's a certain type of energy, it's a certain type of personality, at least according to the ancestral teachings, that you are summoning, so to speak. And you summon that energy in various different ways, which is why we have altars and shrines, and we name certain things. Certain deities that you so-called local deities are just founding ancestors. And so, like my book, I don't know why I keep knocking this thing down. My book Nesubiti, deals with the word for king. And all the word for king in Africa is just a word for elder. That's it, father, mother. Because they're coming from a more simpler, fundamental, as he mentioned earlier, I would say more so, he says everyday life. I'll argue family. Family is the fundamental basis of African spiritual tradition. That's the basis of their whole life. And so terms for family is what is transferred and escalated to when they start forming states. So when you're talking about a king, you're just talking about Big Daddy or Big Mama, because a woman could be a king. And I give several examples, in the book where there are women kings. A king is just a title, it's neuter. It's not the wife. A queen is a wife of a king in modern time, but that's not how it was in Africa. There's a different title for that. But a king, a woman could be a king. Like one of the examples I give is a woman from Ghana who works in D.C. at the embassy. Her name is Peggy. There's a book about her King Peggy. I forgot the exact title, but you can get it, and it talks about her being king, of her saying community. And so when you see Hatshepsut and others, it's not a weird thing. It's a shocker to Europeans, which they make a big deal out of it. But it's not, it's not as common as men in terms of this position, however. But it is not uncommon in general to find female kings, all across Africa. But anyway,
Yes, go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to say I was struck when you got up there that how young you were, and
You know how old is he?
I'm saying. No, it's an old spirit.
Okay.
I said,
That
I'm
was
kind
old
of
spirit.
curious.
Okay.
So how you became what you became.
They say, yeah, but black don't crack. But go ahead and tell her how you got it. What is his response to that?
Mentality. So, if you ever been in New York and Manhattan, that was me on the corners, spitting that, but then, that lasted about 4 or 5 years. I'm in college and start taking some African American studies. Actually, at the school that I was first in, Southwest Texas State University, they didn't have any African American studies courses. So what the students used to do, I got the name Imhotep because I crossed into Alpha Phi Alpha, and in college, and that was my line name. The Alphas at Southwest Texas State got kicked off for hazing, so they couldn't hold any events as Alphas. But what the brothers did, they still wanted to keep some of the programming going, so they created a whole different organization. Black Men United. What was the other organization? It was Swahili for Black Rebellion. I forgot what the term was. But what they would do is it was just a group of students who would get together, research what they could. On Wednesdays, teach what they researched the week before, and then assign, people who would come in something that they had to present something. And so it was from those sessions, not really guided by teachers. No, so it was just students who, was because we didn't have any programs, at the school, and so no classes that you can take on Black African history. And so what they would do sometimes, though, because of course if you're a student organization, you can get funded to bring guests down, so they'll bring a Dr. Ben, Anthony Browder, some other folks in. So we got some outside, but for the most part it was just students. And so from that, then transferring to the University of Houston, actually taking some African studies and African American studies courses, one taught by one of his students, Dr. James Conyers, who's the head over the... Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Dr. Asante's students and prodigies.
You always name. His name is my soul. I'm here.
I apologize.
James Conyers.
Yeah, Dr. James Conyers. And actually by the time he came, I had took all the African American studies courses I could take, but he allowed me to come and sit on his classes, because I was in school for computer science and computer programming. So, you had your 4 classes for your minor, and then you off into this building and you don't see anybody else for the rest of your term. So, but I would still just go, just sit in classes, take notes. I would do assignments like I was getting graded for it, but, long story short. Stuff like that, just really kind of led me, and then I started asking more critical questions, which would require me to get, more specialized books, and started networking with, professors in this area and this area, and just built up a network of scholar colleagues and friends, and now this is where I'm at. I'm sorry.
Yes, brother.
Yeah, I don't know if you have any information on it, but I've heard the origin of humankind, of course, in Africa, but where in Africa, sometimes it's a controversy. You mentioned about the Great Lakes area. I've heard many, at least some theories, that it started further south, around San, Kojin, Namakwa, Herero, all those people in Namibia, Botswana. In fact, the Genome Project has said that those people have the greatest amount of biodiversity of all people in the world. So I don't know if you have any other information about that or not.
It's kind of hard to say. One, because think about it. Human beings have been developing for 4-point-something million years. It's Homo sapiens sapiens anywhere from 75 to 190,000 years. The places where Africans are today may not have been the places where they were in antiquity. And so, for example, the Khoisan used to be all over ancient Egypt. Maybe been one of the first people there. Matter of fact, I'm waiting for a paper to come out by this biologist in France who argues that the pre-dynastic, based on dental records, of Egyptians were actually Khoisan speakers, Khoisan people. So, but anyway, the evidence thus far really, I should put it like this, the biogenetic evidence of the Khoisan type people that you mentioned earlier, because they're located primarily in the south, and there's a lot of human activity, ancient human activity in the south. That's one of the reasons why they say that. But however, the vast majority of the bone, so the evidence thus far where we get the most bones from is going to be Central East Africa. But I've heard the arguments for Southern Africa, but you don't find that type of primate diversity in Southern Africa the way that you are in Central and West Africa, on that belt.
Yeah, if I could just add one comment to that, is that what the doctor is referring to is also very important, because the genetic material that he's referring to, the Human Genome Project does state that among the Khoi and the San, and also a group in Tanzania, I don't remember the name of it.
Something like
that. That those groups are perhaps the most ancient of the Homo sapiens that are still, that in terms of origin. So that's where he's coming from. I think you're right on that. But the archaeological study is correct that the fossil remains are mainly, of course, in that Great Lakes region of Ethiopia and actually Tanzania, Kenya, and also if you go back beyond Homo sapiens, you go back to Chadensis, Sahelanthropus chadensis in Chad. So it's very important, though, to understand that that the whole point is that Africans, that the origin of the human race, in terms of hominids and in terms of Homo sapiens, is Africa. There's no other place. So he's perfectly correct. One more question. Yes. Go right ahead. Yeah,
I had a question.
All right.
Stand up. Ask a question. I hope you don't mind him shooting me while I ask the question.
that's all right.
Peace, everyone. My name is Kufu. I've been getting into a conversation lately with a couple people who are Muslim, and everyone is aware of the language of Arabic, and the parent language of Arabic is Syriac. And is there a direct connection to medu-netcher language and Syriac language? No.
Again, Egyptian is, if we go by Mboli's model, the Egyptian languages, Coptic, Middle Egyptian, are older than Semitic. Semitic, if we go by the new data given by Christopher Ehret et al., we're talking no older than 4,300 BCE. Where Egyptian has been part of its own long branch, coming from Negro-Egyptian archaic. And so again, even still, it still could be argued that, a language related to or ancestral to Egyptian went out into the Levant and they merged and became Semitic. But, it's not a direct it's not a direct connection to where you can say Syriac gave birth, and I'm not even sure Syriac gave birth to Arabic. Arabic is, one of the oldest branches of Semitic there is. But let's just assume, given the premise that you said, that Syriac gave birth to Arabic and also gave birth, to Egyptian, or Egyptian gave birth to Syriac. Oh, it's just no close relationship. And I think Obenga has demonstrated that over the years in many of his works. And so if you would have seen, if there was a direct connection, you wouldn't see such these far-flung words that, for fundamental, just everyday common things, just so different from each other. The way that you see between Semitic and Egyptian. So I don't think there's any evidence for that.
I just wanted you to clear that up, 'cause I've been getting into like small little debates about it, where you're trying to tie in Islam to
I've seen.
ancient Kemetic culture.
But at the same time,
We're not as deep as this brother. But we just give you the surface. But this brother's a serious.
Well, that's good to
He's
know,
serious.
and I want to hear his answer.
That's right. Okay, now you go ahead and give your
it's,
answer.
I mean, he answered, as far as Philadelphia is concerned, he answered part of that. So here's an affiliate. There's spaces across the states. I know a few colleagues that teach medu-netcher online. Dr. Riketti Amin. There's a brother Imhotep out of New York. I forgot the other brother's name, out of Detroit. There's in Dr. Greg Carr, Mario Beatty with ASCAC. There's plenty of people teaching the language itself, just a writing script. So there's spaces you can go, to learn the script. What I try to do is just take it beyond the script, because, I'm coming from this basis that, okay, it's been deciphered by Europeans. And, they're, for the most part, pretty much in control of the antiquities and things of that nature. But they don't have the cultural lens to really get at the heart of what it is that they're talking about. And so, while you can learn the script, there's still these extra steps that need to be. So I'm in that lane. So hopefully, when they're teaching the script, in these spaces, that they can add what we, have been researched. So there's a few researchers like Mboli, Mubabengi Bilolo, Abubakri Musalam, Pierre Norman Digi, Kipkovic Sambu. He does in English. The other one's primarily in French, but it's very few of us that do this type of work in English. Dr. Md.w-km.t, he's a Christian pastor, but he's a bona fide linguist and speaks several languages coming out of Yoruba. And so matter of fact, I have one of his books here. Md.w-km.t, Words and Meaning in Yoruba Religion. Linguistic Connections in Yoruba, Ancient Egyptian, and Semitic. Real deep stuff. And so, every now and then you gotta filter out some of his Christian insertions, but the linguistics are sound. And so that's what I'm looking for. And so.
Second part was just a quick one. Do you have a preference? Because in America, people don't learn language. Do you have a preference as to what kind of languages we ought to be teaching black children, or not? No. Preference, Swahili or Arabic?
It's all Negro-Egyptian. So we do it like this. You learn a classical language, ancient Egyptian.
There you go.
And then you just teach whatever, whatever your preference is. It could be Wolof, any Bantu language. I mean, the consensus over the years has been Kiswahili, and so we're going to have to pick one language to have a common conversation with across the continent. And so hopefully that would be it.
Ezra, got two more questions.
Okay.
Steve?
Is Bantu a European conception?
All the language families is just labels, and so they just pick something from the language to label it, and so Bantu is just a word for person or people. It's the plural for people. Intu is the word for things, objects, existence, living. It's where we get the word ontos in Greek, where we get ontology from. It's the reason why Bantu is labeled that is because when they first started studying these languages, they noticed that this word Bantu and variants of it existed in all these languages. It actually exists in ancient Egyptian too. And so that's another conversation, in terms of, Bilolo argues that it's a Bantu language, but go ahead.
Yes, sir.
I got here a little late. So
Okay.
do you have a book?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. Well, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about now. Yeah.
Two of them today.
I'm going to talk about y'all buying his book, and I'm going to let him get out here and go sit. I want you to go sit. Pardon?
How much are the
This one's 30, this one's 15.
30 and 15. You got that. We're going to ask Asar if you could to take your books out. Take your books out because the people are going to take it and sit at one of those tables out there. All right. So yes. So before you go, remember on. Thank you very much, brother. Yeah, we fin. You something that you want to say?
No.
All right. Okay. So before you go, remember the next program is on June 12th. June 12th. And that's the program with Dr. Daisy Nelson Century and Harriet Tubman. You got to be here for that. June 12th. Be right here. And that, I don't know whether that's a Sunday or a Saturday. But
It's a performance.
yeah, she's going to perform Harriet Tubman right here. So, yeah, so June 12th, write that down. I'm trying to give you time to do like knock to get out there with your books, man, because otherwise the people will leave. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. But anyway, we just want to give another applause. And this was don't go yet. We're not finished. Okay, right. We're not finished yet. I just want you to know that we appreciate all your attendance. We appreciate the fact that y'all come to this. We try to bring you the best
Don't cry.
All right, you sing it, and I'll show you how my voice would have made an unbelievable thing good. Oh, okay, Joy.